console to hail the bridge. Second Executive Officer Treeflogger, Shaman Shack here. We are receiving a CTA from the OCSS Bonewracker. They have failed to respond within the designated time frame. I have logged the ethereal coordinates of the beacon into the comms log. Luga has calculated the physical space coordinate of the Bonewracker and appended it to the comms log. Acknowledged, Lieutenant, Treeflogger replied dispassionately. Treeflogger, despite his name, had to be one of the calmest orcs that Trig had ever met. The second executive officer, SXO, would most likely be going to wake the captain. If Brienne was with him, that might not be pleasant. Trig smiled, imagining what Brienne might throw at Treeflogger. If the SXO were lucky, she'd only throw her Glarg mug, although as many could attest, that was painful enough. As Trig rested his hands upon the stones to resume his monitoring of both the CTA and other messages, he had to suppress his excitement. Unless they were in battle, the work of the second shaman on the night shift was generally quite dull. This CTA had to be the most interesting thing to happen on the ship in at least 10 galactic weeks, GW. A full galactic month, GM. Well, except for Thargus's rather unpleasant dinner. Trig laughed to himself, thinking of his superior's plight. On the other hand, his off-duty life had been much more interesting than his on-duty life. Not that he could tell any of his crewmates. They'd think he'd been squid-addled. Trig chuckled to himself. To be fair, he couldn't blame them if they thought that. He would have thought the same before Lord Thomas had contacted him. Who would have expected beings from ancient mythology to not only be real, but to make contact with him through an ancient talisman that had been passed down his family tree for thousands of years? As a child, even before his first blaster, Trig had been raised on fabulous tales of Orks, the Ork All-Father, his horde of warrior Orks, and their multiversal Ork empire by his great-grandfather, Trig Bioblast, the Shaman patriarch of the family. Orks were the mightiest of the Ork warriors that had risen to legendary renown and prowess, and were then reborn after death to fight alongside Orcus in his battles for the glory of all Ork kind. Naturally, no one believed him. It was all silly superstition with no basis in accredited history. Every AI Trig had ever encountered later in life assured him that Orcus was a myth conceived thousands of planetary years ago, during the interregnum when the E-Core and the H-Core had overrun Gormagast, the home world of the Gormagast Horde Eternal, of which the Orks were a prominent clan. The myths and legends of the Doompire, as it was supposedly known, according to the AIs, were a way for Orks to cling to imagined former glories and rally the clans against the vile corporations that had sought to seize their worlds and steal their wealth. Now, nearly 500 galactic years after the redintegration, when humans and elves, along with their dishonorable corporations, had been driven from the cluster, there was no need for myths. The Horde's triumph spoke for itself, and there were more than enough authenticated historical records to document the Horde's strength during the cleansing. All quite rational and reasonable, the only problem being that recently, while dressing for his shift, he had placed the stone against his chest and sensed a small spark of energy previously not present. He'd investigated it and found a long dormant link to be active. Following it through the astral plane, he'd found himself in some sort of ancient stone temple, where he had encountered real living Orks, intent on a restoration of glory and the return of the Doompire. They were now led by one Lord Thomas, who was either the heir to the throne of Orcus or Orcus reborn. It rather depended on who exactly one talked to. It was all tied to some sort of prophecy, and as everyone knew, prophecies were always notoriously vague and imprecise. The craziest part was that they'd somehow convinced him to join up, along with shamans from some other very strange worlds. He was now, technically, a shaman of Orcus All-Father. Yeah, that was something...